It was a quiet Saturday morning when the message came in. Come here so we can finalize it. No smiley face, no details, just that. But I knew what it meant. All week, my boss had been dropping hints, giving me these subtle nods in meetings, telling me to be ready. I felt it in my bones. This was it. The promotion. The opportunity I'd worked years to earn. And in that one sentence, I could feel my entire life about to shift. But then, like clockwork, he saw it. My husband. He was standing just close enough to read it over my shoulder. And without asking a single thing, his face just twisted. That kind of anger doesn't come out of nowhere. It lives in someone. Before I could even lock my phone, he yanked it from my hands, scanned the message, and launched it across the room. The sound of it hitting the floor was louder than it should have been, and then came the yelling. I tried to speak. Honestly, I did. It's work, I said. It's the promotion I told you about. But he wasn't listening. He never listened when it mattered. Liar, he shouted. You're just like all the others. I knew I couldn't trust you. I stood there watching this man unravel like a pulled thread, accusing me of things I hadn't even imagined, not because of something I did, but because of who he needed me to be in his mind. And in that moment, something in me snapped. Not in a loud, dramatic way. Quiet, controlled, cold, almost. I felt this strange kind of calm, like I'd been preparing for this for longer than I knew. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just turned and walked out. Not because I was broken, but because I had finally seen it for what it was. I wasn't walking away empty. I was walking out with something sharper than anger. I didn't even grab my phone, just my keys and whatever strength I had left in my chest. The air outside felt different, as if the silence had weight, like it was pressing down on everything I hadn't said. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from restraint. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw every insult back at him, to remind him of all the times I stayed, supported, forgave. But I didn't. I let the silence say it for me. You know what's funny? He always talked about trust, about loyalty. But he never trusted me with anything. My thoughts, my dreams, my voice. He only trusted what kept me small. And the second I stepped outside that version of me, the quiet one, the obedient one, he panicked. That message from my boss wasn't just a trigger. It was a mirror. It showed him what he couldn't control anymore. I walked for hours. No destination, just motion, processing every word he screamed, every crack in his voice that I once mistook for passion. And through all of it, one thing kept echoing in my head. He didn't even ask. Not once. He didn't ask who sent the message or what it meant. He just decided, like he always did, like my truth didn't matter as long as it didn't fit his narrative. Somewhere deep down, I think he wanted this, maybe not consciously, but a part of him wanted to prove I was just like all the women he claimed to hate. And when that message came through, it gave him his excuse. The outburst wasn't just anger, it was relief. He could finally punish me for a crime I didn't commit. And me? I could finally stop pretending I didn't see it all for what it was. By the time I got back home, the tension in the walls was thick enough to taste. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He just sat there, arms folded, staring at the blank television like it owed him something. I could feel the anger still pulsing in the air, like a leftover storm. But I didn't feed it. I didn't ask for an apology or explanation. I just stood there, letting the silence wrap around us like a rope pulled tight. He finally broke it. Of course he did. You think I'm stupid? He said with that sneer he wore whenever he felt powerless. You think I don't know what that message meant? I said nothing. What was the point? He wasn't asking. He was performing. Talking not to me, but to the version of me he wanted to believe existed. And I refused to play that role anymore. Not for him. Not for anyone. That night, I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling, heart wide awake. It wasn't just the fight, it was the realization. I had spent years twisting myself into something softer, smaller, easier to swallow. And for what? So someone else could feel bigger, safer? I wasn't angry that he didn't believe me. I was done being surprised by that. What haunted me was how long I'd allowed it. And yet, under all that pain, something new was growing. Not vengeance, not bitterness, something sharper. Cleaner, purpose. He thought he'd broken something in me that night. But what he really did, without even realizing, was unlock it. The next morning I woke up, got dressed and headed to the office. Not because I had to prove anything to him, but because I finally had everything to prove to myself. Walking into the office that day, I felt like I was floating between two worlds. One was still clinging to the chaos I'd left behind, the other pulling me toward something I couldn't quite name yet. I didn't stop to fix my hair or check my reflection. I didn't need to. There was a strange calm inside me, like the eye of a storm. And when I stepped into that elevator, I swear it felt like I was being lifted into a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed. My boss greeted me with a grin that said everything. "It's official," he said. "You're the new executive creative director." My breath caught for a second. The words echoed inside me, bouncing off every wall I had built to survive the past few years. I signed the contract with a pen that trembled in my fingers, not from nerves, but from clarity. All the doubt, the noise, the guilt, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. He kept talking about bonuses, leadership meetings, future projects, but I could barely hear it. All I could think about was how strange it felt to finally be seen for what I had always been capable of. Not tolerated, not underestimated. Chosen, respected. My name, printed in bold at the top of that contract, felt like a quiet revolution. A reminder that even if the world tried to shrink me, I had never actually disappeared. And then came the part I didn't expect. Walking out of that office with the contract in my purse felt more intimate than any goodbye I had ever said. It wasn't just a job offer, it was proof. Proof that I had been right to believe in myself when no one else did. Proof that the worst night of my life didn't get to define me. And as I walked to my car, heels clicking against the pavement, I kept thinking, he has no idea what I just became. The drive back home felt different. The city looked the same streets, same traffic, same sky. But I wasn't the same woman behind the wheel. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, where the signed contract sat neatly inside my bag, like a secret I was still savoring. I wasn't rushing. For once, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation, a text, a softened version of the truth. I just drove, letting the engine drown out the echo of his voice from the night before. When I turned the corner onto our street, something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your chest before your mind catches up. And then I saw it. My clothes, my books, my shoes. Scattered across the front lawn like trash, the front door wide open. And him, standing there like a gatekeeper to a place I no longer belonged. Arms crossed, face cold, as if this little performance made him the victim. "Women like you don't belong in this house," he said, like he was casting a curse. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just looked at the mess. At the life we had built, or at least pretended to. And I realized in that moment, it had never been mine. That house had always been his stage, and I had been cast as the supporting actress. Quiet. Loyal. Predictable. But the version of me he tried to throw out onto the lawn? That woman didn't exist anymore. I had outgrown that role the second he called me a liar without listening. So I bent down, picked up my purse, and slung it over my shoulder like armor. I didn't say a word, not out of fear, but out of choice. He wanted me to beg, to scream, to ask why, like I hadn't seen this ending written in every fight we ever had. But I gave him nothing. No tears, no closure. I turned around and walked away, leaving behind everything, except the one thing that mattered now, my power. I didn't look back, not once. And it's strange how something so painful can also feel like freedom. As I walked away from that house, I wasn't thinking about where I'd go or how I'd start over. I was thinking about who I used to be inside those walls, all the parts of me I'd tucked away to make someone else feel strong. That version of me had been shrinking for years. But this was the moment I stopped apologizing for taking up space. That night, I checked into a quiet corporate apartment the company provided. Clean walls, neutral furniture, no memories, no expectations, just stillness. And in that stillness, I could finally hear myself again. I unpacked slowly, just a few things, and laid the signed contract on the table like a centerpiece. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a beginning. A promise to myself that I'd never again confuse survival with love. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city breathe beneath me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home or explain themselves. I wasn't walking on eggshells or calculating the mood of the room. I was simply there, with myself. And that kind of peace, it doesn't arrive with trumpets. It tiptoes in when you finally stop chasing permission to exist. And somewhere between the silence and the city lights, a thought came to me, sharp and calm and certain. He threw me out like I was nothing. But that day I had become everything. Everything he underestimated. Everything he tried to control. Everything he never believed I'd be. And I was just getting started. Settling into that apartment felt like putting on new skin. Every drawer I opened, every wall I decorated, it was mine. No one rearranged things behind my back or questioned my choices. The quiet wasn't empty, it was sacred. And in that silence, I started building. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. Phone calls, emails, private meetings. One by one, I began aligning the pieces of a life I was finally crafting for me. At work, I was thriving. Creative control wasn't just a title, it was freedom. My ideas were being heard, implemented, praised. I felt sharp again, like my mind had space to stretch without someone shrinking it back down. But even as I soared in that boardroom, a different kind of work was happening after hours. I contacted a lawyer, a woman, smart, calm, relentless. I didn't have to explain much. She saw the pattern before I finished the first sentence. We started digging, quietly. Old bank statements, screenshots of messages, audio clips I had almost forgotten I'd saved, years of subtle cruelty, finally collected like evidence. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming what he thought I'd never have the power to confront. Every detail I uncovered was like stitching a tear in my own story, repairing something that had been broken so slowly, I hadn't realized how deep the damage went. And while I was building this quiet war, his life was unraveling in full volume. Late notices, canceled subscriptions, calls he used to ignore, now returned with urgency. He messaged me, once, twice, a dozen times. Long paragraphs. Apologies wrapped in guilt. I read them. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because silence was finally working in my favor. What he didn't know, and probably still doesn't, is how I stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as a pattern. A case study. A lesson I had finally outgrown. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way he expected. I wasn't fueled by fire. I was fueled by strategy. And there's something terrifying about a woman who isn't trying to scream her pain anymore, just one who's quietly documenting everything. I remember the night I saw his name on a client list. I froze. One of our new partnerships, a mid-sized company desperate for a turnaround, had forwarded his resume for review. He had applied there, maybe out of desperation, maybe out of ignorance. But the timing? Perfect. I stared at that email for a long time, heart steady, not because I wasn't shocked, but because I saw what it could mean. Not for revenge, for resolution. He didn't know the company now had me as a strategic consultant, that I sat in on every major hire, helped restructure leadership pipelines, and quietly built policies from the inside out. I never asked for that opportunity with him in mind. But life, somehow, has a way of handing you the sharpest tools when you finally stopped begging for bandages. And the choice in front of me? It didn't require rage. It just required presence. The lawyer and I reviewed everything again, not to destroy him, but to make sure I was protected. The house, the finances, the digital trail of manipulation he never thought would matter. We weren't just building a case. We were building a mirror. One he would soon have to look into and realize, far too late, that I wasn't the one being examined anymore. There's a kind of power in doing nothing, in not replying, in not chasing closure. Every time he sent another message, pleading, blaming, rewriting history, I just watched. Not because I was cold, but because I was finally clear. I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need to explain my side to someone who never cared about understanding it. My silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. A boundary with teeth. People around me started noticing something had changed. Colleagues began asking if I'd always been this focused, this sharp. I smiled, knowing I'd always had this in me. It had just been buried under years of emotional noise. I wasn't just moving on. I was leveling up. Every new client, every successful campaign, every late-night idea that turned into strategy. It was all mine, and it was growing. Still, the part of me that remembered, the part that had survived, kept checking the locks twice, backing up my files, taking screenshots no one would ever see. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared, because men like him don't fade quietly. They don't let go until there's nothing left to hold on to. And I wanted to make sure, when that moment came, there would be nothing for him to grasp. No opening, no crack. And then it came, the call from the hiring manager. "We've got a candidate for you to meet," she said, completely unaware. I opened the file. His name, his face, his desperate hope printed in black and white. I didn't react, just closed the folder slowly and leaned back in my chair. Not because I was shocked, but because I already knew how this chapter would end. The morning of the interview, I arrived early. Not to prepare, but to breathe. I sat alone in the meeting room, reviewing the files, sipping my coffee slowly. Everything felt still, but charged, like the air before a storm. I wasn't nervous, I wasn't excited, I was steady. Calm in a way that comes only when you've already survived the worst part. This wasn't revenge, it was acknowledgement, and I was ready to give it to him, eye to eye. They brought him in like any other candidate. He walked through the door with a hopeful smile, holding a cheap folder and wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. For a second, I wondered if he'd recognize me right away. He did. The moment our eyes met, something in his expression collapsed. He blinked, froze, then tried to pull himself together with a tight, practiced smile. But his body spoke louder than his mouth ever could, shoulders stiff, throat tight, hands twitching. I leaned back in my chair, legs crossed, fingers interlaced on the table. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer small talk. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the power shift obvious. Then I spoke, softly, clearly. "This interview is to evaluate character," I said. "Why don't we begin with how you treat women in your life?" His mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came out, not even a breath. For once, he had no script. The others in the room, 2 senior executives, looked at me, confused. They glanced at him, then back at me, sensing something unspoken, something electric. No one said a word. It was the kind of tension that doesn't need explaining. And I let it sit there. Let it settle around him like a fog he couldn't see through. That moment wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth. And in that room, truth belonged to me. He finally muttered something, half a sentence, maybe 2, excuses dressed as context. Things were complicated. We weren't in a good place. I've grown since then. I didn't interrupt him. I just watched him scramble to find footing, reaching for words that had worked on other people, in other rooms. But this wasn't one of those rooms. And I wasn't one of those people. I had no intention of rescuing him from the silence he was drowning in. One of the executives leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "You two know each other?" he asked. I smiled, gently, professionally. "We've crossed paths," I said. Nothing more. Because this wasn't the time for stories. This was about presence, about letting the weight of reality press down without giving him a way out. He could feel it. I could see it in the way his hands stayed clasped, white-knuckled, as if letting go would make the truth spill out. I looked at his resume, every line of it suddenly small, forgettable. He had tailored his experience to sound polished, but I knew the gaps. I knew the lies he didn't list, the jobs he lost but never took responsibility for, the messes he left for other people to clean up. It was all there, invisible ink only I could read. And yet, I didn't say a word about it. I didn't need to. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can offer someone is your silence, and a smile. So I ended the meeting the way I'd always wanted to end every fight we'd ever had, without raising my voice. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and said, "We'll keep your file, for training purposes." He didn't move. His jaw clenched like he wanted to protest, but he didn't. He knew. Not just that the interview was over, but that we were. Truly, finally, and on my terms. He stood slowly, like the floor might give out beneath him. He couldn't even look me in the eye. Not really. His gaze flicked past me, searching for an exit that didn't exist. And that's the thing about men like him. They never expect to be outlived by the women they tried to break. They expect ruins. What they never see coming is the rebuild. He walked out of that room smaller than he came in, dragging the weight of everything he used to be. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room exhaled. The executives exchanged looks, unsure of what exactly had just happened. One of them tried to speak, but I raised a hand gently. "Let's move on to the next candidate," I said, already sliding his file aside. I didn't owe them an explanation, not today, not ever. Some things don't need to be spoken, they just need to be witnessed. And I had just made sure he saw exactly who I had become. Later that evening, I sat at my desk alone, watching the city flicker from the window. I thought I'd feel triumphant, maybe even vengeful. But what I felt instead was release. Like setting down a bag I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. He would go home and replay that meeting in his head 1,000 times. He'd twist it, rewrite it, maybe even try to blame it on me. But it didn't matter. I wouldn't be in the room to argue anymore. What stayed with me wasn't his face when he realized. It was mine. The way I had held that moment without flinching. The way I had stayed calm, elegant, whole. He used to say I was too emotional to lead, that no one would ever take me seriously. But that day, I didn't need anyone to take me seriously. I had already taken myself back. The divorce was finalized with one signature. No arguments, no drawn-out courtroom drama, just ink on paper and a quiet goodbye that didn't need words. He didn't fight me on anything, not really. Maybe because deep down he knew. Knew he had nothing left to take. Knew the version of me that once bent to keep the peace no longer existed. And when the ruling came in, financial compensation included, I didn't celebrate. I just breathed, deep, steady, free. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was fertile. I started focusing on something bigger than myself. I began drafting a mentorship talk for the company. Nothing personal on the surface, but every slide, every example carried my fingerprints. I called it, "How to Lead When They Try to Break You." And when I stood in front of that room, filled with young women ready to climb but scared to fall, I told them the truth, disguised just enough to protect the parts I didn't want to bleed. They listened. Really listened. Not to my title or my success, but to my survival. I saw it in their eyes, the flicker of recognition. The way they sat up straighter, leaned forward, like they had just found permission to stop apologizing for their ambition. And afterward, they came up to me, one by one, sharing their own stories. Some cried, some whispered, some hugged me without saying a word, and in that moment I realized I wasn't just rebuilding me, I was clearing a path for them too. That's when the idea came. A program, a space within the company, not for performance reviews or project updates, but for recovery. For women like me who were told to leave it at the door while carrying invisible wounds. I pitched it at the next board meeting, not as a favor, but as a necessity. And to my surprise, they didn't hesitate. They saw the value, not just in the numbers, but in the impact, it got approved unanimously. And just like that, my past became someone else's lifeline. The program took off faster than I expected. Word spread, quietly at first, then louder. HR reps from other companies reached out, asking how they could replicate it. Former colleagues I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages like, "I wish this existed when I needed it." And in every woman who walked through that door, I saw a version of myself. Tired, brave, holding it together in public while falling apart in private. And every time I told them what I had learned, healing isn't weakness, it's strategy. Outside the office, my world kept expanding. I started reading again. Traveling, hosting dinners where no one raised their voice. I laughed more. Softer at first, then louder. The kind of laugh that feels like reclaiming air. I learned to live without flinching, without second-guessing the way I dressed or how late I stayed out. There was no one checking my tone, no one weaponizing my silence. I was no longer walking on eggshells. I was walking on my own terms. One afternoon, I found myself driving through a neighborhood I hadn't seen in months. The houses all looked the same, but my body remembered the way. Without even meaning to, I slowed down as I approached the old place. And there he was, sitting on the porch, alone, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting. I wondered for half a second if he recognized the car, if he hoped I'd stop, if some part of him was still waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. But I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I didn't roll down the window for one last exchange. I just kept driving, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly in my lap. There was no anger in my chest, no sadness either, just that quiet, satisfying hum of freedom, and a single thought that came and went like a breeze. He stayed behind. I didn't. I think the most unexpected part of healing is how ordinary it feels when it finally settles. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just soft. I didn't wake up one day feeling powerful. It happened in pieces, in the way I held space for others without shrinking myself, in the way I stopped flinching when someone raised their voice, in the way I trusted my own decisions without asking for permission. That's how I knew I had made it out, not just physically, mentally, emotionally, fully. The house I live in now has big windows. Sunlight pours in every morning, and I keep fresh flowers by the kitchen sink. Not because anyone's coming over, but because I like it that way. My life isn't perfect. It's real. It's quiet where it needs to be, loud where it matters. I don't need someone to complete me. I am whole. And when I sign papers now, they don't just close chapters. They build empires. His message tried to erase me. Mine rebuilt the blueprint. I never told him what that text from my boss was really about. I never corrected the lie he clung to, never unraveled the fiction he needed to justify what he did. Let him keep it. Let him tell his version to whoever still listens. My truth lives somewhere stronger now, in paychecks with my name on them, in women I've helped find their voice, in a life that feels nothing like survival. And every time I sit across from someone who thinks I'm just another woman in a nice suit, I smile, because they have no idea. And maybe that's the sweetest part of all. The way the story ends, not with revenge, not with drama, but with peace. Real peace. The kind you build from scratch. He tried to destroy me with a message, and in return, I left him with the silence of his own making. Because in the end, I didn't just win. I outgrew the war entirely.